Dracula is an 1897 Gothic horror novel written by Bram Stoker. Since its release, it has been translated into dozens of languages, never been out of print, and has thusly been theorised and talked about for the last century and a quarter, as a feminist text, as a metaphor for capitalism, and as an examination of English colonialism. Since its release, the book has also seen a constant presence on screen, with cinematic adaptations stemming from all over the world. By comparing these adaptations with the source text, contrasting their differences and examining the similarities, one can apply the concept of the false consciousness as outlined by Friedrich Engels in a letter to Franz Mehring, wherein a person's conscious thoughts and creations stem from places either unknown or unexamined by the thinker, allowing these elements into their work without scrutiny. By examining the two German adaptations of the book, Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau in 1922, and Nosferatu the Vampire, directed by Werner Herzog in 1979, one should be able to glean some information about the societal and cultural context these films were made in. Being an unlicensed adaptation of Stoker's book, the 1922 Nosferatu has some changes both major and trivial. The characters' names here are changed, as is the setting, moving from London to a fictional town, Visburg, in Germany. Most importantly, the appearance of the Count, played by Max Schreck, exacerbates the aquiline features and ditches the lavish look he's described as having in the novel, instead resembling the rats with which he uses to bring a plague to Germany. His appearance, and especially his association with rats, closely matches up with stereotypical depictions of Jewish people from Germany at the time. A foreigner from a distant land arrives in Germany, bringing with him a plague of pestilence and death, sucking the blood of the native Germans, much like how the anti-Semitic narratives positioned the Jew as a parasite, draining Germany of its lifeblood. It would initially seem hasty to condemn the film for this. However, F.W. Murnau was one of the leading filmmakers of the German Expressionist movement of the 1920s, a trend which started in the early 1910s, but only in the aftermath of World War I did it become a fashionable mode of filmmaking. Helmut Gruber describes the key filmmakers of German Expressionism as ideologists as much as artists, in their pursuit of awakening and instigating the public consciousness to a cause, making the films made in the style inherently tied to politics and the political climate of Germany at the time. In his famous book, From Caligari to Hitler, A Psychological History of the German Film, Siegfried Kracauer essentially condemns the Expressionists, saying that the films they made, the aesthetics they created, in their own way, influenced the course of events that led to the assumption of power by the Nazi Party in 1933. With this in mind, the film's depiction of its villainous Count becomes something more malicious, and perhaps speaks to a collective false consciousness on the part of the filmmakers, who may or may not have intended the film to be read this way. But as Roland Barthes' Death of the Author outlines, their intentions when making the film are separate to how it is read by the viewer. Therefore, the film can be held accountable for this depiction and its association of the vampire with Jews in Weimar Germany. As a result, Nosferatu is a key text when examining how the Germany of the early 1920s responded to the rise of anti-Semitism on screen, and allows a viewer to divulge information about the cinemagoers at the time. When it came time for Werner Herzog to make his own version of Dracula in the late 1970s, he wanted to close the gap between the great filmmakers of the Weimar Republic and those of the post-war generation. This quote provides an insight into Herzog's thought process behind the film, intending it as much a response to Murnau as it was a remake. Citing Freud's work on the trauma of the perpetrator, S.A. Wilder argues that Herzog's film is about the discomfort the first post-war generation felt, reckoning with the actions of their forefathers. As in the book, and the 1922 film, Nosferatu the Vampire ends with the vanquishing of the Count, played here by Klaus Kinski, at the behest of Mina or Lucy Harker or Ellen Hutter in the 1922 version. But here in Herzog's vision, the final sequence is not of jubilation following the exorcism of evil, but instead shows that the film's protagonist, Jonathan Harker, played by Bruno Ganz, has himself become a vampire. He swears that he has much work to do and rides into the sunset as death on horseback. As Nosferatu is a response to World War I, encouraging the adoption of a new ideology in the wake of its trauma, Nosferatu the Vampire reads as a response to the Holocaust, showing evil as transferable, contagious, and unending. The, up to that point, upstanding Harker becomes an agent of malevolence, and his culpability in the perpetration of evil serves as Herzog's reckoning with the German people's responsibility in the horrors of the Second World War. Herzog's film is not simply a response-cum remake of Murnau's earlier movie, though, and stands as its own adaptation of Stoker's novel, reintroducing characters like Dr. Abraham von Helsing, who were unceremoniously mostly left out of Murnau's earlier effort. One difference revolving around the Doctor, as noted by Judith Mayne, is a variation in hierarchy. Where the novel positions Van Helsing as a representation of modernity in a quickly advancing Victorian London, ultimately slaying the novel's representation of tradition and old-timey folktales, Herzog's film here flips it. Here, Van Helsing is a borderline caricature, and the triumph of the ancient evil in the end signals that the hopeful modernity that Stoker depicted in 1897 has failed, leaving in its wake a broken promise. Returning once again to the idea of the false consciousness of societal ideology manifesting in individual creation, and Herzog's quote about bridging the gap between pre- and post-war filmmaking, it seems as though in his effort to readapt Dracula, Herzog has betrayed something about the spirit of the first post-war generation in Germany. It is not simply, as stated earlier, a reckoning with guilt from the war, but also serves as an examination of the failure on Germany's part. The promise of the idyllic Germany, however reprehensible it may have been, in Nosferatu's ending, is nowhere to be found here. Instead, by inverting the novel's representation of hope for the future, Nosferatu the Vampire reads as Germany coming to terms with not only its culpability and atrocity, but also its own defeat in World War II. Herzog's film, though adapting a book written almost 50 years before the Holocaust, is intrinsically an examination of the guilt and the shame felt by his generation in the wake of its horror. These two German adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel follow pretty much the same narrative as their source material. A real estate agent travels to a distant land, encountering an evil nobleman who invades their homeland and becomes attached to their betrotheds, being ultimately vanquished at the end. Despite their similarities, it is in the differences in these stories, the presentation of that story, as well as the time and place in which they were made, that makes the novel, the 1922 Expressionist silent film, and the 1979 Herzog horror equally unique, and each revealing a great deal about the contemporaneous societies they were made in. It is through the idea of the false consciousness that Engels spoke about in letters pertaining to Marxist ideology that these facets of these films can be gleaned.